This episode of Artist Decoded is brought to you by No Wave Academy. Whether you're a beginner or a seasoned professional, No Wave Academy is your ultimate educational resource to help bring your artistry to the next level. Our renowned roster of instructors include Nick Runge, Mia Bergeron, Sean Cheatham, Kate Zambrano, David Chaffetz, Paul Christina, John Wentz, and many more. Some of these artists have appeared on this very podcast, while others have been featured in exhibitions at the No Wave Gallery and museums around the world. Here at No Wave Academy, we believe that everyone has a unique artistic expression. With guidance, experience, and the proper tools, students have the ability to invigorate and elevate their work. Unlock and unblock your inner creative voice. Join us and walk into the next chapter of your personal artistic evolution. Go to nowaveacademy.com. Type in AD-10 at checkout for 10% off. That's nohwaveacademy.com. Now, on to the episode. Hey everyone, this is your host Yoshino. You're listening to episode number 206 of Artist Decoded. My guest today is Jan Hopkins. She's also our co-host, Justin Dosher Hopkins' mother. She is most known for her masterful sculptures that are crafted out of natural forged materials. And in her work, she uses citrus, melon, and pomegranate peels, lotus pods, fish skins, leaves, and seed pods as well. She studied basketry with indigenous and contemporary artists, where she learned the intricacies of working with traditional basketry materials. Then in the early 90s, she was challenged with the depletion and unavailability of many of the natural basketry materials. So she then began experimenting and innovating new ways of processing organic materials that she successfully uses in her work today. Jan and her husband, Chris, have also embarked on a deeply personal collaborative project about part of her family's history during the Japanese-American incarceration during World War II. And piece by piece, Jan has been puzzling together family stories that are both heartbreaking and inspiring. We talk a bit about that in this episode as well. And Jan also states, "This project has changed the essence of my work and has challenged me to innovate new ways of construction and storytelling." Chris and Jan's two-person show was exhibited originally at the Shack Art Center in Everett, Washington in 2018. A future exhibit is scheduled to open at Bainbridge Island Museum of Art in 2022. The timing of this exhibit marks the 80th remembrance anniversary of the first Japanese Americans taken from their homes on Bainbridge Island and sent to Manzanar's concentration camp. Jan is an award-winning artist and has exhibited across the United States. Her work is included in permanent museum collections across the country, including the Fuller Craft Museum in Brockton, Massachusetts, the Museum of Art and Design in New York, the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston, and Racine Art Museum in Racine, Wisconsin. So I hope you all like this episode. If you'd like to support the podcast, please go to our iTunes page, leave us a review. You can also find us on Patreon if you go to patreon.com/artistdecoded. We also just started a YouTube page, so go over there and you can find full episodes and little episode clips as well. All right, so here it is, episode number 206 with Jan Hopkins. Hope you enjoy it. So, thanks for doing this. I appreciate you for taking this time and, taking time out of your day. And before we were recording, we were talking about learning disabilities and how early on you were diagnosed with having what you would think is dyslexia now. Is that correct?
Well, I was never diagnosed. They didn't diagnose us back in the Ice Age.
Back in the Ice Age.
No, it was just that I when I was young, I had trouble reading. And visually for me, when I looked at a book, I just couldn't make sense of it. It was just not, I could see, I saw the words, I understood the words, but they didn't make sense. And a lot of times I jumble, like one time we were playing Pictionary when I was older, and instead of glove bots, I thought it said boxing gloves. And, my brain just kind of makes up things. I'm not sure. But, I can read now, but when I was younger, I really struggled learning how to read.
Yeah. And then you were saying before we started recording, you were talking about how you came from a family of musicians, and your mother, I know, is a professional violinist. And I mean, your son, I work with him all the time, but he's a working professional artist. And I was just thinking, before, first of all, how it feels to be part of a lineage of professional artists, but then you were talking about the nuance of just learning in different ways and not being so in tune with music, like your family lineages is, for instance, right?
Right, right. I think actually I had really wonderful parents. My mother was very talented, and my father just loved what he did. He was a farmer, but growing up, he always told us, just find and do what you love to do. And my mother, during all of my issues with reading and people used to call disability, she was doing everything she could possibly do to try to help me learn how to read and, get through school, basically. So, yeah.
Yeah.
I don't know. I just, looking back, it was really hard when I was younger because having really smart siblings, I think, didn't, didn't help me.
In what ways?
In the way that, I was always compared. I was the third youngest of a family of 8, and they were all smart. And I was always the teachers. I went to school in a real small community. The school had 70 kids in it. It was an old schoolhouse, brick schoolhouse, just 15 in each grade. And first, second was together. Third, fourth was together. Fifth, sixth were together. There were 3 rooms for 6 grades. So I grew up and went to a really like Little House on the Prairie kind of school. And so all the teachers knew my older brothers and, oh, do you play an instrument? Oh, your brother was so smart. Oh, your sister was just so great and personable and smart. And so I had to kind of live with that growing up, that, being compared with my brothers and sisters that thrived in their different careers. I think they're all now retired. Yeah, they're all now, except for one of my youngest sisters. She's still a professor. But yeah.
Do you think that gave you a complex early on, in terms of the way that you identified yourself?
I was honestly, I was kind of a weird little kid. I think just lived in my own little world. My mom saw that I was really interested in art and sewing and crafts, and so she encouraged that. She encouraged anything that I could find that I was good at. But then again, I wasn't going to become a rocket scientist or anything.
Well, I mean, I think we all have our own purpose in this life, and I feel like the more that we can be authentic with that purpose and lead into that, I feel like the more that we can be happy with our decisions. At least this is just the way that I feel.
Yeah. No, again, I feel really lucky that I had the parents I had, and my mother was just so focused on finding something that I could thrive at, and so from a very early age, she encouraged me to do art forms, and, I like to draw, so, uh, she really encouraged that in me. And I was also kind of an OCD kid. I just
Hmm.
love to clean. I love to, put things in order. Everything had to be just so. So I was sort of in my own little world a lot of the time, doing arts and crafts and just keeping myself occupied.
Hmm. Well, it sounds like those initial inclinations to want to do art led you to becoming a professional artist in some respects. Is that right?
You know, I don't know. I really was a lot of what I feel like I was very lucky. I didn't intend to be an artist. I started basketry solely from an interest, seeing basketry, indigenous basketry at the Heard Museum in Arizona. I was just overcome by this unbelievable, like, wow, who are these people, and knowing that they use natural materials, and that were really unidentifiable to me. Roots and bark, and growing up on a farm, I didn't recognize them to be what they were. They were just these beautiful baskets, and I just wanted to learn how to do it as a hobby. And at the time I lived in Los Angeles, and I was helping Chris with his at the studio kind of bookkeeping. Prior to that, I was working. I had worked for an oil driller. I'd worked for attorneys,
Hmm.
accountants, property management, mainly property management. So I
Hmm.
wasn't, before I started helping Chris, my background was more working bookkeeping, secretarial. So it was just the idea that a hobby idea for me.
Hmm. But how much do you think that was an active decision on your part to want to do more clerical work for work? Or did you think that there was a place for you to become an artist? Or did you even have any interest? Or did you just fall into it?
I,
What's your
I,
perspective?
I always like to do crafts. I mean, my husband, he's so sweet. I used to and paint T-shirts, and they were in a boutique in Santa Monica, and
Hmm.
he thought that was, you know, really cool. And I was just doing it part time. I just took some classes. I just decided I was going to paint T-shirts, so I was painting T-shirts, and you know, um, I was always doing something crafty, sort of. I did take some design classes at Santa Monica College. You know, just just more, you know, with interest in learning something new, not with the idea that I'm going to be an artist. I was already working, and I was just interested in making things, and so uh, I started taking classes with no intention of becoming an artist.
Hmm. Yeah. I do know that you got started as a professional artist like in your mid 30s. Is that correct? And you were already a mother of four.
Right.
So when you and Chris, your husband Chris, got married, at the time he was working as a professional illustrator, and you were helping him with like, sort of, as you were saying, like more clerical work or
Yeah. Taking care of the
and things like that.
business. Yeah.
Yeah, doing bookkeeping and those sort of things. And I was wondering, like, how do you think those observations of his career played into your initial decision into wanting to become an artist?
I think the reason I felt like I wanted to do something when I was working in a more, in as a property manager or something, you have an identity. You that's what you do, but when you're working with your husband and you kind of lose your identity as someone that has a job. And, I think for me, I just was looking for a hobby to kind of find something that I could focus on other than just working, taking care of the business. And so it was more for me, because when I started basketry, I was pregnant with Mariko, and I was just obsessed with it. I actually, we moved from Los Angeles to this area, and the year that I actually started, it was the day I started basketry, or the year I started was the year that basketry school opened. And I just took every class I could take. And it was almost, serendipitous that we moved at that same time and they opened, and they, Michelle Berg, the one who owned the basketry school, had all kinds of national artists come through, and even Hmong artist, Japanese bamboo artist, Jiro Yonezawa. There were just so many opportunities there, and I just loved it. And I tended to be more interested in natural materials. So, but I tried to learn all the different techniques and traditional styles that I could actually take. So it was workshops, it was basically workshops that I took.
Yeah, it's really interesting because it seems like you were saying, you initially wanted to find some sort of hobby or some sort of area to be able to focus on and, create a craft maybe. And it seems that, there were certain things along the way that kind of guided you to that, because it seems like you weren't planning on moving to Washington specifically to be able to take these workshops, right? But
right.
Do you find that sometimes the ideas or certain things in life, like I don't really want to be like overly romantic about this idea, but do you think that sometimes that great ideas find you, even though you may be like asking the universe or something, to resolve this giant question that you had about the next phase of your life, but in some ways it sounds like, through that energy, it almost found you in a way.
It's really, I think just in looking at my own life, I think everybody's fated to do something. And whether you're watching or being guided a certain way, or if you're looking to be guided, or if, I think there's a path directly for each person in life. And sometimes, you skip off of it and you don't, understand it. But if you're really, I wasn't searching to be an artist. I absolutely just, it was something that I wanted to learn, and I got obsessed with it. And I had no vision of becoming a fiber artist, basketry artist, contemporary basketry artist. It wasn't until I really, after a couple of years, I just decided, well, maybe I'll just go national. It'll pay for all my supplies. Maybe, there's something more to this, and 3 months later, or a month later, I guess, I was handed this prospectus for I think it was a craft show. So it wasn't just fiber art. It was all sorts of crafts. And that was a month later. And so I'm always telling my kids, just put it out in the universe. It'll come to you.
Mm.
you know,
Yeah.
it's it, but I think you also have to be on the right path. I mean, sometimes you want something so badly that you get off the path that you should be on. You know,
Yeah.
um,
No, I agree. Yeah. It's interesting that you say that too, because I feel that, there's so many different variables and certain things that you're not in control of. And sometimes you may want, for instance, let's just, since, this is an art program, um, we'll talk about art. But, I think there's a lot of what I've observed is there's a lot of professional artists or people that want to be professional artists and they want it so bad. But I think because the reasons are more so result oriented and they're more so about what that looks like, from like an outsider's perspective, or there could be many different reasons for it. But I think sometimes it takes you out of the intuition of what you should be doing, something that you're maybe meant for, as opposed to something that you think that you want to do, whether that be from secondhand values, from maybe your parents. I mean, there's certain things that are at play there, right? But there's just certain things that you're not in control of at all times, and so I don't know. It's interesting just to think about the energy that you put out into the universe, how that can come back to you, and that can also be positive or negative, right?
yeah. Well, and I had no growing up, I had no expectations of being anything really. you know, I,
Uh-huh.
and I just feel like I've been led, whether it's, maybe by my ancestors or what. I just, things would happen, and I felt like I I want to call it lucky, but it just seems like I was just supposed to follow this path. It's the only way I can explain it.
Hmm. Would you consider yourself an intuitive and spiritual person?
Yeah, yeah, I think I am. Justin
Mm.
is. Maybe he doesn't
Mm.
know it, but he is.
I think he know. I think he knows it. He's definitely very good at dissecting things, and he sees things at a different perspective than I do. So it's interesting to be able to talk to him about different projects and things because we both see things in kind of different ways. And I just think that's kind of interesting too.
Yeah, I think
Um,
he got that from me.
hmm.
No, I'm.
Well, no, I mean, it's interesting what you were saying. I don't know if this is like before we started the conversation or started recording the conversation, or during, but you were saying that with your, what's it called, with the materials, for instance, like you could see a sculpture sculpting itself almost in your head. Like you don't do any preliminary drawings or anything, is what you were saying. And you can kind of already see it kind of coming to life. And I'm curious. I mean, if I were a neuroscientist, I'd probably try to like dissect that in a way, but I'm not. But I'm curious, like, what do you think guides you into creating the pieces that you create?
Well, I think initially it was all about the materials. It was all about discovering ways to work with the materials. Traditionally, I learned a lot from traditional artists, traditional basket makers. But then I think I I felt it really important to uh, learn the sort of rules of how to. There are a lot of rules, and for a good reason, probably. And then once I learned, I just almost immediately started breaking all the rules because it was all about experimenting. I look back at indigenous artists and, how did they learn to do this? There was somebody who actually picked something up and then started working with it. And then all these traditional patterns of how to do this exact type of basket evolved. And I was thinking, well, I want to kind of explore the idea of using that idea of there's other ways you can create basketry, because basketry was where I began. And let me just see if I can do it differently. Maybe there's a better way for me. I'm not saying everything that I do is better, but I'm saying, I guess that goes along with kind of an intuitive sense where, maybe there's a way that I can create my work without, another way, a way that my hands say, oh, that's really comfortable, or the way I want to design something. I want you to see the full leaf. I'm not going to cut it up into pieces and make it unrecognizable. I want that beauty of the leaf or the beauty of the material to shine. So I have to design a different way of assembling. And did I answer your question?
No, yeah, no, you did. But I was gonna just going off of some of the materials that you were talking about. Just for our listeners out there, I'm curious what sort of materials you work with, and I mean, I know just from what I've read on your website, but I mean, just for the listeners out there, can you describe the things that or the types of materials that you use?
I started out using really traditional materials, whether or not in the Northwest, whether or not they seem traditional. The most traditional materials I used were cedar bark, roots, spruce roots, cedar roots, and those were all indigenous materials. There are a lot of restrictions on in Washington. Oh, and also seaweed. Seaweed and kelp were actually traditionally used, not so much now, but that was the first material that I just loved, and I just started developing ways that with traditional techniques, but with this bull kelp, I just loved working with it. But the materials that are untraditional, I've started because I realized that I was lacking the materials I needed because of the restrictions on these particular materials to really protect the materials, the trees that they come off of, and so I started working with the concept of, well, trees, bark, skin. Then I could probably work with orange peels. I started working with orange peels, grapefruit peels. It went on beyond that to melon peels. I was using agave leaves, which at the school they provided, and they used to strip it or they used to use it in weaving. I just thought they were so beautiful that I started weaving around them, and so that you could actually see the agave leaves. Those were from California, and I wish when I lived in California I knew that there was such an abundance of these around. But then I started using pods. Anything that I could find, I would really experiment with and try to make them as viable as I could. And visually, I was really interested in visually making and designing a beautiful piece. That was my initial. And then, because I'm married to who at one point was an illustrator and now a narrative painter, I kind of gravitated to my artwork being narrative and very conceptual. So that's when I started moving still staying in the concept of a container or a vessel, but moving a little further away from basketry. Yet they are, a lot of my torsos, they are vessels, they are containers. So whether you want to think of them as baskets or whether you want to think of them sculpturally, that's up to the viewer, I guess.
This episode of Artist Decoded is brought to you by Mubi, a curated streaming service showing exceptional films from around the globe. Every day, Mubi premieres a new film, each one thoughtfully handpicked from new directors to award winners. Beautiful, interesting, incredible movies. There is always something new to discover. In an observance of LGBTQ Pride Month, I sifted through Mubi's Pride and Prejudice list and watched an incredible film entitled Henry Gamble's Birthday Party by director Stephen Cohn. It spoke about feelings of shame within a devout religious context, while also diving into repressed sexual desires. It's a beautiful coming-of-age story that I also found very compelling. And you can try Mubi free for 30 days at mubi.com/artistdecoded. That's mubi.com/artistdecoded for a whole month of great cinema for free. Now, back to the episode. So speaking about more of the narrative storytelling-based work, is that what made you want to investigate the Japanese American internment during World War II in further detail?
I think when I started doing narrative, it was because I had young daughters, and I knew how hard it is sometimes to grow up, and I was sending them messages whether they knew it or not. I wanted to have uplifting, and most of my all of my torsos are feminine, and so to me it was just sending messages, not just to my girls, but to women in general. I was very focused on, positive messages.
And what sort of messages were those exactly that you were thinking about?
Well, I would hear a lot of my ideas just kind of pop up from listening to NPR or listening to things going on in the world. And in the beginning, when I started putting messages on things, it was, I think the first shoes I did, it said, "Judge her when you've walked in her shoes." And it was about, I had heard about this single mother that had 3 children that she was trying to support, and she became a exotic dancer, and so that she could spend time with her kids during the day, and she worked at night. I guess she was brave enough to kind of come out and say this, and so that idea, of her, just that's where the idea of putting these bold platform high heels and all this wording on it, that's where that idea came from. So I really paid attention, and the reason I did a lot of my torsos was to accentuate the beauty of the materials, and then slowly evolving into statements. I did a whole series of goddesses, and tried to use the material symbolically, and the type of weaving I was using symbolically to represent that particular goddess. And then I went into doing women icon. I decided I wanted to use a quote from, like maybe Eleanor Roosevelt or Marilyn Monroe, or I actually used a lot of Marilyn Monroe's quotes, and I put these really kind of, typical Marilyn Monroe type of quotes on the outside. And then on the inside, they were all these sad and self-doubting quotes. Uh, and I kind of labeled it Norma Jean on the inside, and on the outside it said Marilyn Monroe. And it was just, some of her quotes were so interesting to see, and then her very sad and morose quotes about herself and her self-doubt were all I included on the inside. The outside, were all of her other quotes that were to the public. So that was the first torso I did, and then I went on to doing all kinds of torsos of women icons.
Yeah. Do you think that was a conscious social commentary that you were making about a woman's place in a patriarchal society?
I think when the idea of women icons, I think they're usually very strong, but they live through adversity. They live through a lot. I'm sure the different stories about Eleanor Roosevelt, and all of the adversities she went through, and Marilyn Monroe, and some of the others, but yet they were really they're iconic because of the way they went through their lives. And I wanted to focus on that because I felt like all of us have adversity in our lives. You can overcome a lot of that by what you do in life. And for me, when I looked at Marilyn Monroe, I thought, look at where she came. She had the desire to be who she was. There was a lot of adversity. There was a lot of pain in her life, but yet everybody knows who she is. And so there's a lesson there to me of her life and who she was, and whether you think she's tragic or whether you realize that this person grew up from nothing and became this person that you say Marilyn Monroe, everybody knows who you're talking about.
Yeah, totally.
So.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think being able to examine that story, and us on the outside, we can place our judgments upon her, but we didn't live through the trials and tribulations that she had to go through, and especially during that time period, right? So yeah. I think the more that we can understand the nuance of, or potentially try to understand the nuance of what she went through, the more that we can become empathetic people. And I think that's probably a better quality to be than just place a judgment on someone, right?
Well, and I think, we all live in adversity, and we have to remember that. We have to remember that life is a challenge always, and it's how you go through life, how you that might make the difference, sure, you're struggling with this, but look at what Eleanor Roosevelt did in her life. She had many, many challenges. And I think I don't ever think of women as being flawed. I think of them as having these challenges that they can overcome and, become great in their own life. So I hope it's inspirational. I think of these women as inspirational to me, the ones that I've picked. So,
no, definitely. Well, I'm curious too. Just to kind of like switch gears a little bit, but I wanted to talk to you about Americans Interned. That was you and your husband's show at Shack Art Center. And I was just curious what led you to want to work on that project together, and what were those initial conversations like?
Well, actually, a lot of it's because of Chris's interest in history, and on the other side, my my interest in learning about my history. Growing up, I absolutely had no idea I was Japanese, and I think a lot of people growing up in the era that I grew up in had the same experience because of World War II. I had no idea that this was the case until I started talking to people and researching. But I think it was something my parents really rarely spoke about until maybe after, I think it was in the 80s, when there was a formal apologize to the Japanese Americans about the imprisonment and the incarceration. And mostly my dad would talk about what happened. But I think the first time I heard about it, or my mom just gave me, I'm not sure, I think it was a National Geographic when I was a teenager, and she just kind of handed it to me and said, this is what we went through. And it was just overwhelming. I wasn't much of a reader, but I could see Japanese all in relocation camps or incarcerated, and with these people on the towers,
When your parents did speak about being interned, what exactly would they tell you about it?
It's interesting. My dad, when he first started talking about it, he'd talk about how they were just taken away, within days, and not able to take care of their businesses. And they had a farm in Idaho, so not Idaho, but in Fife, his family, and most of the information I got was actually from my uncle, because my dad just, he's a real positive. He was a real positive person, and he just kind of matter of factly told us about, well, when we were in camp, and he'd tell us sort of silly, funny things that happened, but they were also like shocking. Like one time he said that there was because they were in Minidoka, and there was a stray cow that went close to the fence, and it was at nighttime, and the people in the watchtower, the guard tower, saw it and thought these were people who were trying to escape. So they shot the cow, and they found out that it was a cow in the morning. But, but then the idea of them thinking that it was people trying to escape, and they aimed and shot and killed this cow, it's just like, that was shocking. But, just little tidbits, he was a real positive person. And I think one time somebody asked him, I think it might have been my sister-in-law, how did he feel, when he discussed something, and after the war, when he was trying to get jobs, and there was so much discrimination, and he couldn't get even rent a house at the time, because nobody even though it said it was for rent, no one would rent to the Japanese. And I think it was my sister-in-law said, well, how did that make you feel? And he said, desperate. He just he didn't have that, like that anger that you would think he would have. It was just, I did the best I could, and at the time, they lived through this, and it's hard to understand how you could live through that, but that was just the reality of the times,
it's interesting just to think about, putting ourselves in that position, and if we lived, it seems almost outside of the spectrum of reality to think of, in our modern society right now, that our rights are stripped away and us being discriminated against now, but, it's kind of crazy to think that a little less than 80 years ago that happened to, your parents and a lot of Japanese Americans, and just thinking about that in general, I don't know, it's just a fascinating, it's almost like a privilege to be able to just have to think about it and not have to live through it,
Exactly. The first time that the idea of what happened to my parents and all my relatives, I mean, all of them from Seattle and California, and just taken away from, their homes. And the idea of the fear, I think about the fear even after the war. Well, if I don't keep my head down and I don't, just, not make any noise, and if become invisible sort of to your own heritage, and become, although, when our grandparents came to the United States, they really insisted on them not speaking Japanese. You're American, you speak English, this is who you are now, so my mother never learned how to speak Japanese. I think once she started working with Dr. Suzuki in Japan, she started taking college courses in Japanese. So that was sort of stripped away during immigration, where you have to prove that you're a proud American citizen, So when you look at what happened to that generation, who really were Americans, their parents really, and a lot of them, I don't mean to say I know that every single parent, but they were stripped of the, kind of told you have to show you're good Americans. And then to have this happen. And then after the war, just trying to, I think for my generation, we were stripped of an identity because we weren't, I didn't have a lot of my Japanese heritage taught to me. And I think the fear of looking like you're Japanese from Japan, I don't know, I can't even begin to understand it. But when 9/11 happened and there was so much hysteria over the Muslims, I began to understand the feeling my parents must have had. Being somebody that was labeled as the enemy,
Yeah. Yeah. And in an interview that you were doing, you also talked about how your mother had a friend that was Chinese during that time, and how her Chinese American friend would wear a pin or something to identify herself as being Chinese American as opposed to Japanese American. Is that correct?
Yeah. And that to me was really sad. I think my mother was in her early 20s, very shy. And I think that was her best friend. And for her to not, to almost immediately lose a friendship because of her identity was just unbelievable. It was unbelievably sad to me.
Yeah, that is unbelievably sad. Yeah, and it's interesting how, because of the ramifications of the American history and decisions that were made from the president at the time, how that trickles down to Japanese Americans, and how Japanese Americans were thrown into concentration camps, and then how that plays into the way that Japanese Americans associate themselves as people, or rather disassociate themselves from their the culture of origin. Right?
Yeah.
And I think about that just from a personal level too, because I, like you, did not associate myself as being Japanese American probably until I was, I don't know, 13 or 14. because I wanted to assimilate with the people that were around me, and, we're highly social beings. So you think that, and we've evolved to be social beings. So you want to be accepted by other people. And the way to be accepted, you would think when you were young, is to assimilate into the culture around you.
Right.
Right.
Yeah. Well, and for me, my parents never made it back to Seattle. They ended up in Idaho. So I grew up in Idaho. So that was totally different. And it was interesting because, yes, there were Japanese families in the area because my dad was a farmer and there was a lot of farmland. There were probably 3 or 4 other families. But later on in life, I found that their parents weren't interned because they lived in Idaho. They lived away from the coast. The Japanese that lived on the coast were the ones that were incarcerated. The ones inland weren't. So, that was kind of an interesting thing to find out, that it wasn't everybody I grew up with who were Japanese, that their family were also discriminated against after the war, but they didn't have the experience of their parents being incarcerated. And so discrimination went on well beyond, World War II. And
of course,
I think growing up, I didn't understand discrimination. I didn't understand what that was, and I remember when I was little, I remember distinctly, because my mother had so many kids, we were like mother duck with the baby ducks kind of going down the street. And I saw an older man and he looked at us and he crossed the street to walk on the other side of the street. And, I thought, wow. In my own mind, I thought, oh, that was really weird,
yeah.
But things that people might say that are rude to, us or in general, me, maybe, I just didn't understand they were prejudiced against me. I just thought they were mean, angry people. I guess there were the advantages of growing up in an area where, there wasn't a lot of discrimination. We lived on a farm. Every once in a while I would go downtown Nampa, and there was, Nampa was a very small town at the time. So now that I look back, I think about those times, when I thought that was somebody that was being incredibly rude, but I didn't think of it as them being prejudiced against me as a race. Right. So,
yeah. Well, yeah, that would make sense. I mean, you were just a kid and you only have so much information in your brain at that point. So you probably just thought that was just a weird occurrence, right?
Yeah. So, So growing up on a farm, kind of isolated, I guess it had its advantages. I think, when I think about it, I had a best friend growing up, but my dad had to drive me to go play with her. She lived on a farm too. So we were really, definitely when I moved from Idaho to the Los Angeles area, that was a complete shock. I'd never seen so many Japanese in my life.
Yeah. So I'm just curious, like, that show was 3 years ago that you did, Americans Interned. And what are your thoughts on that now? Since we went through a global pandemic, well, and I guess we're still in it, but I guess, now that you have some distance from that show, like, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, there actually isn't a distance from that show because couple of years ago, I actually made a proposal to another museum or a
Oh, wow.
museum, and it's at the Bainbridge Island Museum of Art, and they said, "Listen, we'd like to have your show on the 80th anniversary of when the Bainbridge Island people were taken away and incarcerated." And
Wow.
there's a remembrance at Bainbridge Island. The Bainbridge Island Japanese Americans were the first to go to Manzanar to be
Wow.
shipped off because they were on an island, and I guess, were considered high risk. They were mostly strawberry farmers, but they were considered high risk because they were, kind of at a point where I'm just guessing at this point, but they were on where they could maybe send messages, be spies or whatever,
I see. Yeah.
So, so we're very, very excited about that. I'm still working on a few pieces. Chris is still working on pieces, but it's still ongoing. And I guess to answer your question, the reflection is that, in the pandemic and the times we're going through now, I don't think it was ever as bad as it could have been when my parents were incarcerated and then came back and tried to make a living for themselves. I don't think it could ever be that bad. I think there's enough learning and empathy by a lot of people in this area, and I hope that in the United States, in the world, that I think the challenges are different, but yet we still have people, for whatever reason, don't like different races. There's still a lot of learning and education that needs to be done, but I think we're in adverse times. I
Definitely.
don't have unusual times too because of the pandemic. I'm sorry there's a certain amount of ignorance in the world, but we're always on a learning curve. I think to help educate and help. I always think of Rodney King's and why can't we just get along? Why is this so difficult? Definitely unusual times. I think of my parents and I think of my grandparents and I think, okay, first they immigrated, my grandparents immigrated, and then they went through the Depression, and then they were incarcerated. I mean, and for us, up until now, I thought we're so lucky. But maybe those are the lessons that we need to revisit.
What lessons?
About there are people who are prejudiced. How you go through your life is important. How you, as an individual, carry on in your life is important. How you react to these type of issues, that's important. And I guess just there's a lot of lessons that need to be revisited and learned, I guess, is my opinion.
Yeah, no, I agree. Yeah, I mean, I think that life is always constantly, whether you're observant of it or not, but there are so many lessons that can be learned on a daily basis. And it's good to understand what sort of contribution that you want to make on this planet. And I mean, I think the good thing is that with being an artist, depending on what type of artist you are, it's something that you can work on yourself personally, but that personal message can also resonate among other people as well. And there's a certain power to that, I think. And I mean, it's interesting to just think of, this thing that affected your family and something that also affected my family as well. But, you and Chris doing this Americans Interned project, I think that is something powerful and that shouldn't be forgotten within history. I mean, it just seems that there's a lot of things within history that people don't talk about because it's uncomfortable to talk about. Right. But I think that's
Right.
the thing that needs to be talked about, is the uncomfortable thing.
Right. And, there's much more information about, World War II, the incarceration of Japanese Americans, imprisonment. The dialogue has changed from using words like internment, the much preferred word now is incarcerated, because they were incarcerated, they were imprisoned. I feel like, for me, I did it to understand my own background. And my sister did a lot of searching in history, my sister Judy, in history about my family. And we all started, once my dad and my mom and my uncle were able to start talking about what happened, then there's something about when you don't have an identity per se, like you didn't grow up having a heritage background. Right now I've been traveling a lot internationally, and I've been invited to be a part of some international gatherings of indigenous people, and it's overwhelming and thrilling to see them dance and do their art and be really connected to their culture. I just embraced that so much because I never really felt like I had that in my life. And I think that, again, is another thing that I was just in my fate to be connected with Northwest Coast indigenous friends and artists, and then to be included with these really culturally rich artists who have also had to bring back some of or preserve their culture in the way of the arts, dancing, singing, all of that. So that's, I've been privileged to be a part of that. And I hope, future generations can hold on to that because it's so important.
Yeah, I agree. I definitely agree. Well, thanks so much for taking the time to do this, and I appreciate you for sharing, some of your thoughts, and for people to be able to find out about your artwork as well.
Well, thank you for inviting me, and I hope I didn't embarrass JT. That's all I ever worry about.
I'm sure he'll be fine. I'm sure he'll just be fine. Actually, wait, I do have one more question.
Okay.
And I ask almost everyone this, but what sort of advice do you have for artists and creatives?
Advice?
Mm-hmm.
Just the advice my parents gave me. And, both of them, just do what you love to do. Find what you love to do and do it. And it may not be, I always feel if you're struggling, then maybe this isn't your path, but it might be some other genre. If you have art in your heart,
Yeah.
Yes, I think there are an abundance of variations and types of genre that you can look at. Don't be afraid to expand and look at other genres. You know, I say if that's being an artist is really in your heart to do, and you're struggling, maybe you should be in a different genre, because this
Yeah.
world is so big. This art in general is there's so many opportunities, and I think Justin has been trying to explore each and every one of them.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, I just think I think if you are having any doubts, or if you are struggling, keep moving, keep going, keep looking, because I was lucky enough to just find this passion, and then find dealers that, were really behind me, and, introduced me to a world that I didn't even know existed. So.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, I think being adaptable and being open to change is are resounding themes that come up on the show a lot. And yeah, I think that's really important to keep in mind, that to be able to find your flow, like to be able to find the thing that, or to keep asking questions, I guess, right? Keep on being curious.
Yeah. Well, and I think sometimes I see people who are really struggling to make it, and I think, well, you're kind of a fish going upstream. Maybe if you go with the flow, you'll actually find that thing that comes totally natural to yourself.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. No, I agree. Yeah. Yeah. Sometimes the better thing to do is just to be able to flow with the current.
Yeah. Go with the flow, right?
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Well, Jan, thanks so much for taking this time. I appreciate you taking the time out of your day to sit down and talk to me.
Oh, you're welcome. And it was a great pleasure to talk to you. I'm just so proud of both you and Justin for putting this out, and the No Wave Academy and everything. I just think it's so amazing what you young people are doing these days.
Oh, that's really nice. No, that's really nice of you to say that. Yeah. We're trying.
Yeah. Well, keep it up. Keep it up. It's important. It's important to share, and it's important to, have this community.
I agree. I definitely agree. Yeah. The community aspect, I think, is, it first comes to yourself, right? And your decision making, and, we're all responsible for our own happiness, right? But to be able to take that happiness and bring it to a community and to share the thoughts with the world, I think is like super important. So, which I think is, I really wanted to talk to you. And, well, first of all, we never really had a long conversation. So there's that, but, to honor your art and, the things that you've created, I think are really important, and to be able to share your story and your family story with, the people that listen to this podcast, I think is important.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. I appreciate it. Yeah. Much appreciated.
Yeah, of course. Well, all right. Well, have a good rest of your day.
Okay. Talk to you later.
All right.
Bye-bye.
I'll talk to you later. Music for the podcast is by Rarebit, aka Justin Dosher Hopkins. Creative producer is Noah Wainwright. YouTube and creative support is by Tyler Scully. Thanks so much for tuning in. See you next time.